All right, so as we're talking about men and women in the church, obviously this is all built off of the foundation of a more general category of just complementarianism as a whole, right? And so a lot of what we're going to cover is going to look at just the theological category of how did God design and equip and then deploy men and women to be complementary reflections of the triune God. So John Piper says this in Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Says, when the Bible teaches that men and women fulfill different roles in relation to each other, charging man with a unique leadership role, it bases this differentiation not on temporary cultural norms, but on permanent facts of creation. In the Bible, differentiated roles for men and women are never traced back to the fall of man and women, fall of man and woman into sin. Rather, the foundation of this differentiation is traced back to the way things were in Eden before sin warped our relationships. Differentiated roles were corrupted, not created by the fall. They were created by God. That's so important in anything we talk about with complementarianism. As we relate to complementarianism in the church, one of the key passages, there's a few passages that people look to, but one of the key passages is 1 Timothy chapter 2. Paul writes this to Timothy, "Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." So as we look at men and women in the church, we start obviously with the concept of biblical complementarianism. So there really are, there's so many different worldviews out there right now, but foundationally, we're kind of looking at two big buckets, complementarianism and egalitarianism. Complementarianism would state that God created male and female, equal in personhood and value, but different in role and function. It's about as simplistic as you can get on a very big topic. God created male and female, equal in personhood and value, but different in role and function. Egalitarians would, on the flip side, claim that God created male and female equal in every respect, including equality in role and function. Andreas Kostenberger has written on the subject a lot as well. I brought a book with me. It's up in my room on God's design for men and women. He helped Tom Schreiner write a book called Women in the Church. It's kind of like the super beefed up version of what DeYoung did. It's very thick, very beefy, so he's thought really well on this topic as well. Kostenberger says this, though. The current cultural crisis, however, is merely symptomatic. So he's talking in this, too, of a cultural crisis. And as I was talking to Josh, we had dinner last night, I was talking to him a little bit about this. It doesn't seem like a lot of this has really hit Ethiopia yet. You guys correct me if I'm wrong there, but it doesn't feel like a big feminist movement has really hit here like it might has South Africa or the States. There is a movement. Only in the main cities. Yeah. Well, regardless of whether it is felt in its full impact or not, I would be shocked if it's not on its way here and will be coming in greater force. So America right now is just it's a bit of a mess with all this stuff. Kostenberger, though, reflecting on this big gender movement, everything that's happening, he says the current cultural crisis, however, is merely symptomatic, of a deep-seated spiritual crisis that continues to gnaw at the foundation of our once shared societal values. If God the Creator in fact, as the Bible teaches, instituted marriage and the family. And if there is an evil being called Satan who wages war against God's creative purposes in the world, it should come as no surprise that the divine foundation of these institutions has come under massive attack in recent years. Ultimately, we human beings, whether we realize it or not, are involved in a cosmic spiritual conflict that pits God against Satan, with marriage and the family serving as a key arena in which spiritual and cultural battles are fought. If then the cultural crisis is symptomatic of an underlying spiritual crisis, the solution likewise must be spiritual, not merely cultural. Okay? So that was a long quote. What he's going for there is obviously we are fully convinced and believe from Ephesians 6 and a number of other places that we are fighting the prince of the power of the air, the spirit of darkness. We're in a spiritual warfare. And so if God's design is ultimately in place for men and women, we're not mainly talking about how do we talk about cultural norms. We're really needing to start the conversation on how do we think through this from spiritual foundations. Does that make sense? One quote that I think is really helpful by a man named Paul Jewett, and this is quoted in Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. He says, "Sexuality permeates one's individual being to its very depth. It conditions every facet of one's life as a person. As a self is always aware of itself as an I, so this I is always aware of itself as himself or herself. Our self-knowledge is indissolubly bound up not simply with our human being, but with our sexual being. At the human level, there is no I and thou per se, but only the I who is male or female, confronting the thou, the other, who is also male or female." That's a complicated quote, but can anyone take a stab at what, so as you look at that, give me a sort of synopsis of what Paul Jewett is saying there. Anybody want to take a stab at that? Exactly. Exactly. When we think of me, when I think of I in this quote, I think of me, I think of myself fundamentally not as an abstract human, but as a person who has the sexuality of a man. So I can't detach the fact that I am a man from how I think of myself. Whether that's always how I think of myself or not, which it's not like I'm consciously all the time thinking that I'm a man, but I can't separate the fact that how I think about myself is directly attached to my sexuality in the same way that when I react to you men, as in his quote, the thou, the other person that I'm speaking to, I'm not simply interacting with you as abstract humans either. I'm seeing you for who you are as either a man or a woman. And there's no way, because sexuality is foundational to who we are, it's how we're created. It's intrinsically bound up to our personhood. There is no way that I could look at you and not realize and interact with you in a way that is abstract. I'm interacting with you in a way that recognizes who God created you as a sexual being as well. Does that make sense? Good. So what we see in the relationship between men and women, it's not meant to be, as we look at who we are created to be, as we look at the roles God's created us for, it's not meant to be looked at as a parade where one is in front and one is in the back, and we're kind of following in a processional, one in front of the other. It's not a race. It'd probably be helpful let me do this too. It's not a parade where we're walking one in front of the other. It's not a race where we're trying to elbow past each other. and get to the finish line first, but instead it's a dance. So the two genders in this dance have different steps. If you think of any time you see partners dancing, they're not doing the exact same thing most of the time. They're working in, I don't know, all those fancy words, in rhythms with each other, in complementary steps or dispositions, and yet, when they move together as one, it's perfect harmony. It's what it's intended to be. They need each other and their differences to be a part of the beauty of God's design. So, two of the quotes or the definitions for biblical manhood and biblical womanhood, John Piper and Wayne Grudem did a lot of work on this in the early 90s. Lots of work. Egalitarian movement coming into the States. Churches just dividing over this issue that we're going to talk about. And so they roped in a lot of different people, but they worked to get definitions for what is biblical manhood. When we talk about biblical manhood, what do we mean there? And they worked to get a definition for biblical womanhood. Think about how hard that would be. If you really didn't have a definition, you had instincts, you had convictions from Scripture, but you didn't have an actual definition, how hard that would be to craft a definition for what do we mean when I say biblical man? What does that mean? So I haven't found a better definition in the 30 years since this was put out, and my pastors haven't either. This really is what's used repeatedly in recovering biblical manhood and womanhood. He says, they say this about manhood: at the heart of mature masculinity. So at its heart, mature masculinity is a sense of benevolent responsibility to lead, provide for, and protect women in ways appropriate to a man's differing relationships. So again, at the heart of mature masculinity is a sense of benevolent responsibility to lead, provide for, and protect women in ways appropriate to a man's differing relationships. And on the other side of that, at the heart of mature femininity is a freeing disposition to affirm, to receive, and to nurture strength and leadership from worthy men in ways appropriate to a woman's differing relationships. So that is very high-level overview of complementarianism. And before we jump into how that particularly looks, because what we'll talk about with men and women in the church obviously is going to have a lot of implications for complementarianism as a whole. But any questions about anything we just talked about there, those definitions, those quotes, anything jump out? Good. All right, let's keep looking at what that looks like then for male headship and authority. So Denny Burke says this: in her humanity, she is equal. So talking about women. In her humanity, she is equal. In her role, she is subordinate. She is his subordinate. Though modern people may deny that it is so, the Bible teaches that equal value is not undermined by unequal roles. So again, the Bible teaches that equal value is not undermined. We're not somehow saying that we're not equal in the sight of God and have equal dignity and personhood because there are unequal roles. Okay? Many would argue that male headship was a result of the fall and the curse, and that the job of the church must be to undo those effects. However, God created male and female distinctives before the fall. The curse brought a distortion of roles, but not a change in roles. God cursed them in their roles. The church's job is to help undo the distortion of roles caused by the curse, not the roles themselves. Vern Poythress says this: women are not to be elders because such a role would not harmonize with the general relations between men and women in marriage. Thus, the differences between men and women within the context of marriage and family carry over into differences in roles that men and women may assume within the church. That's foundational. So as we have convictions about what God says about men and women in a family relationship, in a husband-wife relationship, which we see in Genesis 1 and 2, which we see in Ephesians 5, just to say a few, because we see an authority placed on the man in that relationship, that carries over into the differences that we assume and understand, thank you, buddy, in the roles and relationships within the church. One more quick quote, and then you guys go grab some coffee and come back. Kevin DeYoung says this: the biblical pattern of male leadership is never an excuse. It's never an excuse for ignoring women, belittling women, overlooking the contributions of women, or abusing women in any way. In fact, the truest form of biblical complementarity calls on men to protect women, honor women, speak kindly and thoughtfully to women, and to find every appropriate way to learn from them and include them in life and ministry, in the home and in the church. So as we're looking at the role distinctions, though, so male as head and authority, again, we're seeing this. This has so much carryover between men and women in the home and men and women in the church. And Vern Poythress, again, gets to that. So just to reread this quote as we get back into the content. Women are not to be elders because such a role would not harmonize with the general relations between men and women in marriage. Thus, the differences between men and women within the context of marriage and family carry over into differences in roles that men and women may assume within the church. Now, we're not basing our ecclesiology that women aren't to be elders off of just text about what they can do in the home. We're not making an exegetical jump from, well, if a man should do this in a marriage and a woman should do this complementary to one another in the home, then we're just making a leap into the church. The Bible speaks to how the assembled people of God relate, and it speaks particularly in Paul's letters to the Corinthians and in 1 Timothy in particular about particular practices here. But it can't be lost on us that it's a close connection. And the reason why is because they're rooting both marriage and church into created realities. So just to emphasize again up here that in the Bible, differentiated roles are never traced back to the fall. Rather, the foundation of the differentiated roles is traced back to the way things were in Eden. So they were created by God. And we see this because some of the rationale for women not speaking in church and male having male authority, 1 Timothy 2:13. Why? For Adam was formed first, then Eve. So man was created first. In order of creation applies directly to Christian practice. This is Paul's argument for male headship in the church. 1 Timothy 2:11 through 13. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I don't permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. Why? For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Kenneth Matthews says this: the priority of the man's creation is important for recognizing leadership, fellowship in the garden. Second reason why we can see authority in the home and in the church. Women were created from man. Woman was created from man. Told you my brain's not cylinders, guys. 2:22 and 23. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, this is the first thing he says, this at last, it's bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. It's the first poem of the Bible. 1 Corinthians 11:8. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Paul's making a theological argument about leadership and submission, all rooted in what happened in God's created order in the Garden of Eden. Okay? Adam was given authority to name Eve. Genesis 2:23. Again, she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Genesis 2, 19 and 20. Our biblical headship and authority is expressed in naming. God named Adam, Adam named Eve, Adam and Eve named their children. Adam also named the animals over whom God had given him dominion. All of that's happened in Genesis 2. So in that naming, they have a responsibility for that which was named. Adam and Eve were given responsibility to leave. Adam was given responsibility to lead and instruct Eve. So God told the man. He told Adam in Genesis 2, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, "You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." That was told to the man before, right up here, the rib was taken out of Adam. And so Adam's responsibility as he sees his beautiful helpmate, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, I don't know what the time difference is, but we're 3 verses removed from God instructing Adam, "You may eat of all of this, but do not eat of this." 3 verses later, he has his helpmate come. He rejoices over her. It was his responsibility to be able to communicate to her the rules of the garden. We don't see that God comes back and says, "Oh, okay, you're equal in role and responsibility, so let me tell you this too, Eve." There's an assumption there that what has been told to the man is now tasked for him to tell to the woman. One would be able to logically see either that God would have held off on this command until Eve had come and addressed both of them in functional equality of role and function, or that he would have made a second time coming in and telling Eve, "Oh, you didn't hear this? I don't expect Adam to tell you because that would be domineering and authoritative. So let me tell you, Eve, you can eat all this stuff, but don't eat this." It's not what happens. God gave the command not to eat of the tree of good and evil, not to Eve. In fact, the command was given we just covered that. She was to accept and obey her husband's instructions as a representative authority of the command he received from the Lord. So 1 Timothy 2:14 says this, "And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." So again, what Paul is rooting his argument in is what happened in the Garden of Eden. Eve was deceived and sinned when she disregarded her husband's leadership and instruction. The original sin involved a reversal of created order. So instead of God to man to woman, we have a total reversal of that, where we have serpent speaks, woman listens, man follows. So Genesis 3:6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Genesis 3:17, and to Adam he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all of the days of your life." So Adam disobeyed and sinned when he refused to obey God, but instead follows his wife's leadership, his wife's commands that she gave to him, the fruit to eat. He listened to his wife when he should have been leading his wife. In cowardice, he did not make his leadership stick. When she goes to take from that fruit, his job as a benevolent responsibility was to say, no, authoritatively tell his wife, absolutely not. God, our Creator, who walks with us and gives us all good things, has told us not to do this, therefore we will not. That was the man's job, and the man failed in that job. So when God comes down to confront sin, who does he address? Does he address the person who eats the fruit? No, he addresses the man. The woman was deceived and ate, but the man failed in his leadership task. 1 Timothy 2, 11, 14, just again reiterating, all of these things are happening because male authority in the church is meant to, in God's created order, both hear the commands of God and then be able to give those commands in the context of the church now in a way that's authoritative, underneath the authority of Scripture. So there's a lot of challenges to this view, obviously. We've talked about that. Number of challenges to this view. Colossians 2:8, though, we want to keep in mind as we have any challenge to any doctrine. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. Cindy Jacobs, not a complementarian, says this: controversial passages lacking consensus from godly people of different persuasions usually mean that the passages aren't clear enough to resolve with certainty. Therefore, we must be tolerant on different views on those passages. Well, it's one interpretation of how to see women in the church. Wayne Grudem says this: so in essence, this approach guarantees that a decision about women teaching and governing in the church will be made without reference to the passage in the Bible that speaks most directly to the topic. So, number of challenges from biblical interpretation. So, what the opposite role would see here, so what egalitarians would argue, is that any differentiation in roles ultimately destroys equality. Okay? So any differentiation in roles, if we can't do the same thing, then we can't be equal. Okay? If we can't do the same thing, then we can't actually be equal. Equality looks like us being able to do the exact same things when we want to do them, how we want to do them. Scripture, though, does not differentiate roles among equals. Equality and distinctions are modeled in the Trinity, right? 1 Corinthians 11:3, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. Okay, everybody can accept that, that's fine. The head of a wife is her husband. Ooh, whoa. Why would we say that? And then the head of Christ is God. Okay, well, if we're talking about headship equaling authority, and if someone is tempted to throw a flag on the play, that's an American football reference, by the way, guys. They want to throw a flag on the play of that, the very next clause helps put it in perspective that a difference in headship does not equal a lacking of equality. Because if the head of Christ is God, and we're using that logic, that naturally means that Christ is inferior to God the Father. No, absolutely not. They are one. The Father sins, the Son submits, obeys, joyfully follows the Father's commands, but they are one God, equal in deity, equal in personhood. There's submission among equals in the Trinity, 1 Corinthians 11:3, which we just talked about. Is Christ temporarily or eternally submitted to the Father, the Spirit to the Father and the Son? The Trinity demonstrates mutuality and service within a structure of headship and leadership. So, ultimately, what we can conclude from looking at how the three persons of the Trinity submit and mutually work in an equal relationship is that submission never began. It's not that Eve came on the scene and all of a sudden we have our first instance of submission. Submission has been an eternal category and God's entirely perfect holiness. This is critical because if this is true, there's no arguing that submission means inferiority. So some of the things that people would look at, though, is they would look at Ephesians 5:23. and talk about how, let's actually flip there together, Ephesians 5:23. I was good at Bible drills as a kid, so I beat you out for it. Says this, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church's body. So they look at that Greek term there of head, kephale, and say that it means source. Woman springs from man and from man's seed. It doesn't mean authority. So they would say that the church springs from the source of Christ, just as creation of woman comes from Adam's rib and then from procreation from Adam's seed as source, but doesn't reference authority. But first, the reality is no case in Greek literature where kephale means source and not head as applied to persons. And then as we look at this particular context, what we move through is talking about authority structures. So wives, submit to your husbands as the head. And then we move into what that looks like in wives and husbands. But then children, obey, submit to, follow, authority structure, your parents. Then verse 5, bondservants, obey, authority structure, your earthly masters. So the context of here doesn't support at all kephale, meaning source instead of authority. Other thing that they would say, hypotasso, or subject to. They would say submission is required in Ephesians 5:21, right before we get to these passages on wives submitting to your husbands. Ephesians 5:21 says, submitting to one another. So that hypotasso of subject to or submitting to, we all submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so if we were to take 5:21 as a foundational text, we would be able to, one might be able to argue, people have argued, that all following submission is really just how we submit to one another. What Paul is saying is this mutual submission, and this is how they take it, of wives and their husbands. Yeah, they're talking about submission here, and they're talking about sources of authority and headship, but it's really just one submitting to another. Well, again, that argument really breaks down, one, in that submission is always one way in Scripture. This interpretation dissolves all authority structure in the home and society, and all submit, but some submit differently with mutual submission. And so we are called as Christians to submit to one another out of love. Look to serve one another. Look at the needs of others. Look to use our gifts for the upbuilding of the church, of the one another's. But that doesn't mean that there is no authority structure in that submitting. And in fact, all of that submitting out of one another somehow negates forms of authority. And again, the argument still holds, I think, for the rest of the chapter of Ephesians 5 and into Ephesians 6, that if we're using submitting to one another, he then shows them that submitting to one another comes in different roles, in different authoritative structures, both in wives and husbands, children and parents, slaves and masters. Let's flip over to 1 Corinthians 14:36. Man, I'm on point with my Bible flipping today. So he's talking about the gifts of the Spirit. So starting in verse 31, Paul writes this, for you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all be encouraged. And the spirits of prophets are subject to prophets, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Verse 36, or was it from you that the word of God came, or are they the only ones it has reached? If anyone thinks that he is a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge that the things I am writing to you are command of the Lord. And so the argument here is looking at 14:36 of that word or. And it's saying it's almost using that word as a complete denial. So it's almost verbalizing, the argument would be, is that that negates what was said earlier about women learning in quietness and submission and asking their husbands. And in verses 36 through 40 is almost this, are you guys nuts? Do you not know better? The claim would be that in verses 33 through 35, Paul is actually quoting the Corinthians, where the Corinthians would say, that women must keep silent in the church. They must be submissive. That as the Corinthians are saying that, verse 36 comes in and says, no, there's no way that's actually correct and accurate. And the reality is that or there is it never used to negate what comes before it in the Greek. So that, and you're just kind of looking at a structure of text and saying, everything that just came, we don't like it, and therefore we see something that we want to now use to negate it. And that's kind of what the argument is used for. So authority, the word authority used in 1 Timothy 2:12. The argument is not that they can't have authority at all, but instead that they can't misuse authority. So in 2 Timothy 2:12, when it says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority, they would say that what that means is actually an abuse of power, an abuse of authority. But the word never has a negative sense. So plus misuse of authority is never permitted in Scripture. So why would they need to particularly say that a woman shouldn't misuse authority? That's never been something that's a category. So a couple of other just things here. In this same, a lot of arguments have been made against, and let me find, at the next break, I want to find a great Wayne Grudem quote that speaks to this a little bit. So in 1 Timothy 2:12 of teach or exercise authority, they would say that teach is positive, but have authority is negative. So what their argument would be that it's okay for women to teach or to preach, but just not to hold authority. But in the construction, both verbs must be either negative or positive. You can't be one negative and the other positive. Plus, biblically, teaching is, particularly as we get right into a section of qualifications for overseers, that kind of teaching is authoritative teaching. And so both that grammatical structure doesn't work, plus we're moving straight into the qualification of an overseer where a teaching is done in authority. They would look at Galatians 3:26 through 28, that there's neither slave nor free nor male nor female, and say what this passage now shows that we really shouldn't make differentiations between male and female. It's not role related, but it's value related. So this actually is a great verse that talks about the dignity of all people. If you're coming from a culture that doesn't see value in women in the same way that that value of men, or that somehow women are lesser, Galatians 3 shows all of God's people. All people made in the image of God are dignified. They're in the imago Dei. There is no lesser in value of anybody, male or female, Greek nor Jew, slave nor free. So there's no levels of salvation for different classes of people. They would look at 1 Timothy 2:12 and say that that women were teaching false doctrine in Ephesus. So this is contextual to the culture. As you look at 1 Timothy, this chunk here in 1 Timothy 2, which really is the crux of the debate, they would say that this is just because women in Ephesus were teaching false doctrine, and so he was specifically shutting down them teaching and holding authority because of the context they were in. But there's no corroborating evidence for that. DeYoung does a great job of breaking that argument down in particular, of looking at the culture of Ephesus, which is where they were, and just really reiterating that we have no reason to think that women, the argument is that women in Ephesus at this time held great authority and had great power. And therefore, because he's writing to Ephesus, this church that Timothy's in is in Ephesus, that he's somehow saying, while all the women around you are doing all of these things of great power, you women should not teach or hold authority. And that's very specific to that time and that place. There's nothing to support that. Leon Morris says this, always happy to punt to a smart academic. But Paul has no intention of arguing the matter with anyone, given the wordy battles, contentious, with anyone given to wordy battles. Such people are capable of prolonging an argument indefinitely. In the face of such an attitude, Paul points to universal Christian custom. Christians have no other practice. Exactly who he means by we is not clear. Maybe Paul himself, might be the apostles generally. But nor do the churches of God show that what he has outlined is the common practice throughout the churches. We have no such practice. We have no other practice. I think he's referring to the freedom in which women would come almost without showing themselves coming inappropriately into this act of praying and prophesying. So as we're looking at head coverings, 11, 2 through 16, maintain the traditions that I delivered them to you. The head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband. The head of Christ is God. So as we're talking about marking someone as under authority with the head, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short, but since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. So again, we're showing in even the head covering element of that a man covering his head is almost showing that they're under a different authority directly than God himself, and so it's a disgrace for him to show that. But a wife having a head covering is showing that she's living under the headship of her husband. Neither was, for man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority, i.e. the head covering, on her head because of the angels. Don't ask me any questions on that. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For, so as they're gathered together, they're not independent of one another. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves, is this proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered, for her not showing herself as someone who is living in authority? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man, so and then we get into, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. Men and women acting in the church in ways that are natural to who they are in God's created image. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, he's almost anticipating maybe particularly women, but maybe men as well, saying, how dare you tell us this? We spend a lot of money on good hair braiding products or whatever. We're not going to cover it up. And he almost anticipates an argument here. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. All right, we're going to keep moving a little bit. So some of the other different arguments, though. So we were on false or uneducated teachers, culturally conditioned teaching. So they're looking at the 1 Corinthians 11 on head coverings and 1 Timothy 2 on that argument of domineering women in Ephesus, and saying all of that's cultural. The whole thing is cultural. But Paul's teaching is in line with the created order, and it's not specific. It's not entirely specific on time or place. Plus, having that opens up a slippery slope to should we just toss out everything because it was written in the ancient Near East. Part of the other challenges would be progressive revelation. So Paul is moving toward equality in his writings because even in 1 Timothy 2, he says, let a woman learn quietly. Listen, it's revolutionary for Paul to even say, let women learn. That was not a part of the culture. And so Paul has a high view of women. And that's one small expression of how he sees how the church, how the Word of God, how learning the Scriptures is important still, regardless of gender. But Paul is, what the argument would be is that Paul is moving toward equality in his writings, and Paul was confused. As a Jew, he would have opposed equality, but not as a Christian, so he was just learning along the way, and what we have is early learning. Reality is Galatians is written first, neither male nor female. This would be, if that progressive uncovery for Paul was true, one would think that 1 Timothy would have been written first, where he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or hold authority, and Galatians to be something written later. There's neither male nor female. But the reality is Galatians is the first written epistle we have from Paul. 1 Timothy is one of his last writings, so that doesn't make sense either. And then there's challenges to complementarianism from subjective feelings or intuition. And so we'll move through these pretty quickly, but it's just simply time for women to be able to minister in all areas. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way. Scripture teaches something else. We're not driven culturally. We're driven by biblical arguments. Men and women have been fruitful many women have been fruitful in their ministries. That's so true. But the long-term effect of us equipping and installing women who have been fruitful in different ministries is a distortion of what God has called us to in biblical leadership. Women were leaders in the Bible, sure, but they never in the sense of leading the home or the church. Doesn't mean that women don't have gifts that make them natural leaders, but we don't see in Scripture them leading the home or leading the church. Women are vital to ministry. Women can and do minister in many vital ways in the church, but they're vital to ministry, absolutely, but they're instructed, and we follow that instruction for them not to teach or govern. Gifting is not gender. So gifting, not gender, is conclusive. Scripture is conclusive, is what we believe. So a gift may be used, but in the proper realm, driven by Scripture. And finally, I'm called by God. This one's a tough one. I told you guys my mom's an ordained minister. She's called. What do you say to that? So God doesn't call people to do things that are unbiblical. So a subjective sense of your calling is not definitive. Did he override his word to call you? No. Is it not possible that you heard something correct? At the end of the day, anything we see, hear, think, feel, has to live under the authority of God's word. Greg Allison says this: Paul's instruction should be understood as prohibitions against women communicating biblical and theological truth and exercising legitimate authority in the assembly of the church. Paul's instruction should be understood as prohibitions against women communicating biblical and theological truth and exercising legitimate authority in the assembly of the church. All right, just a couple of quotes, and there's so much to be said. CBMW website, I hope will cast an even bigger vision for this. But this is a beautiful doctrine. This is not an oppressive doctrine. This is just such a wonderful It's a wonderful thing. It creates beauty. Kim DeYoung says, as complementarian, I believe that God's design is for men to lead, serve, and protect, and that in the church, women can thrive under this leadership as they too labor with biblical faithfulness and fidelity according to the wisdom and beauty of God's created order. Bruce Ware says this. This connects complementarianism, and there's a lot that could be said for this, but connects it to the beauty of the Godhead. Because the structure of authority and obedience is not only established by God, but is even more possessed in God's own inner Trinitarian life, as the Father establishes His will and the Son joyfully obeys. Therefore, we should not despise, but should embrace proper lines of authority and obedience. In the home, believing community, and society, rightful lines of authority are good, wise, and beautiful reflections of the reality that is God Himself. This applies to those in positions of God-ordained submission and obedience, who need then to joyfully accept those proper roles of submission. It applies equally to those in God-ordained positions of authority who need to embrace the proper roles of their responsible authority and exercise it as unto the Lord. We need to see not only authority, but also submission as godlike. I'm going to say that again. We need to see not only authority, but also submission as godlike. We more readily associate God with authority, but since the Son is the eternal Son of the Father, and since the Son is eternally God, then it follows that the inner Trinitarian nature of God allows both authority and submission. That's where we get submission was never created. Just as it is godlike to lead responsibly and well, so it is godlike to submit in human relationships where this is required. It is godlike for wives to submit to their husbands. We honor God as we model both sides of the authority-submission relationship that characterizes the Trinitarian persons themselves. Afraid to ask. Any other questions? This is a big topic. Again, it deserves way more than hour and a half, 2 hour, whatever it's been, treatment. But this would be, if there's a topic worthy of a lot of research, study, and precision, it would be this one. A lot of them, but this one included. All right.